Welcome back to another episode of Novelio. Today is Friday, May 14th, 2021. I'm going to continue on with my reading of Hot Winter Sun, written by Jessica Russell. The weeks after Catherine's departure were the longest in Julian's life. He rode slowly across the fields, thinking they looked as bare and ugly as his soul felt. It was mid-January now, and a cold, damp, and misty fog hung over everything. The hedgerows were full of glistening cobwebs, the sky was grey, the bare branches making intricate patterns against it. Only a bit of colour came into view, and thereby small patches of golden gorse which bloomed virtually year-round in Cornwall. He remembered how he once laughingly told Robert that the only times a man shouldn't make love to a woman was when the gorse was not in bloom. Heavy-hearted, he rode on, thinking of nothing except the brother who would never again be at his side. He still felt numb and sick and overwhelmed with grief. Still saw him everywhere he looked, and he was completely shattered by the fact he would never hear his voice again. No one was ever more alive than Robert. He thought of how he enjoyed life and made all situations better somehow with his outstanding outlook on everything. He lit up every room he entered and refused to believe that there was not a solution for every problem. Far less cynical than me and far happier. He realized there was so much to learn from Robert's approach to life and his way of always making the good somehow outweigh the bad. Maybe it is not too late to learn. He forced himself to visit his grave and relentlessly drove away the images of his last time there with Catherine. He dropped to his knees near the headstone and said aloud, "I believed it would be you and I until the very end. I didn't think it possible for there to be ever only one of us. The world isn't right anymore, Robert. Tell me there is something of your legacy that will allow me to make it so, whether now or years from now. Just don't leave me entirely alone." Shortly after, he was surprised to find that Jennifer had come along behind him. "I can't bear it, Jennifer," cried Julian at once. "I can't bear the way I treated her. I blamed her for Robert's death. What did I do? What have I done?" And there was no need for him to explain what he was referring to. Suddenly he was crying, unwilling or unable to stop himself, and Jennifer slowly dropped to her knees next to her brother on the cold, hard earth. He felt her arms around him, and she was crying too. "Robert forgives you, Julian. You know that." And there on the plain, as the sun dropped in the sky, there was the sorrowful image of brother and sister, arms around each other, sobbing for that other who was no more. Amidst the dramatic events that had taken place, it almost seemed to have slipped Julian's mind that he was now the sole owner of Briarwood. Rather than someone who administered the estate with his brother and father, Richard suddenly took over some of the duties, as he and Jennifer both felt they could not leave him to his own devices at the time. Although Julian was more capable than of running the estate without help, and in many ways stepped naturally into the role. Other times he seemed to care little or nothing for what happened anymore. He had always believed he had everything, and now suddenly found himself unable to think of a single reason to go on. He wanted to be alone constantly. His brother and father were dead. Catherine was gone. Even the estate that had once been so interesting to him seemed to have no spirit left. There was too much of Robert woven into every fibre of his life, and there was nowhere he could go that Robert's ghost did not walk with him. Over the next 2 months he ricocheted between rage and despair and could hardly keep his mind on anything of importance. He finally asked Richard to formally oversee the household accounts for a while, as he felt he could not add simple sums without Robert or Catherine creeping into his mind and refusing to leave. He denied callers and sat alone in his room in the dark, hungry and tired, still unable to believe everything that had happened. He was constantly irritable and argued about everything, and was sure that the household was as frustrated with him as he was with himself. Yet there was no help for it. Finally, one day Lizette came to call and would not be put off. "Darling," she began, "I know how difficult a time this is for you. It is for everyone. We all loved Robert, but you are brooding on his death from morning till night. You must try to shake yourself out of this despondency and rejoin the living. He would not have wanted you to die with him." She was seated near the fireplace opposite Julian, and as always looked beautiful and elegant. Julian nodded slightly, but he was completely uninterested in anything she had to say, as her words only further depressed him. As soon as he was able, he fled her company to go brood in isolation with the spectre of regret, which had become his constant companion. One day he was on his way to see Richard. Rook stopped him to tell him that there appeared to be a problem with thieves again. Julian answered absent-mindedly that they should put extra men on each post around the livestock for the next month or so. What do I care about a stolen hen when Robert is lost to me forever? He did go over some of the accounts with Richard, but by the time they had finished, he remembered little or nothing of what they had discussed. Finally, his brother-in-law said, "Why not take a trip, Julian? Go visit some of your relatives in Flanders or Paris and get away for a bit. I'm perfectly willing to stay here and run things until you return. There is an excellent manager installed at Grantley, so I could easily do it. Although it was likely not wise for anyone to leave the country amidst the turmoil of war, Richard and Paul were becoming desperate concerning how to pull Julian from this despair. When Jennifer heard the idea, she encouraged him to consider it too. When Julian did not reply, Jennifer said, "Mourning is all well and good, Julian, but taken to excess it becomes self-indulgent and unhealthy. You have to do something to begin to get past it." "What good would a trip be without Robert along?" he replied, and wandered from the room. Yes, the family were very worried, but at a loss regarding what to do. At last, Catherine reached her aunt's home and, feeling both exhaustion and joy, stepped up to knock on the door, looking forward to the moment where she would finally be reunited with some semblance of family. In doing so, she almost collided with a young girl who was sweeping the steps and immediately asked for Magdalene. "Magdalene Carstairs? I'm afraid she died, miss." Catherine felt a sudden wave of dizziness and inwardly assured herself that it must be a language barrier. Perhaps her French was not as good as she believed. She quickly asked the girl again what she had said, and she reaffirmed that Magdalena was deceased. "When?" Catherine finally stammered, but the girl could not offer any more information, as the house had been empty when her family moved in, and that was not long ago. Catherine somehow managed to say thank you, and then stood there looking helplessly at her surroundings. After a moment or two, she turned and began walking slowly away from the house, realizing she couldn't stand in a daze in the middle of the street. Nevertheless, she was far from calm inside and could come up with no coherent thoughts at all concerning what to do or where to go from ease. Returning to Briarwood was unthinkable, yet how could she survive with no help? The notion came to her that perhaps she could find Sabrina and Armand, and they could take her in and begin making plans from there. She had been determined to find them anyway. On impulse, she turned on the lane where the girl told her the cemetery was and searched until she found her aunt's grave. The marker was a crudely designed cross with only her aunt's name and March 1590 to April 1644 etched in the surface. They were careless with the date, Catherine thought in irritation, knowing that if she had died in April, she couldn't have sent a message months later. She shook her head in weariness and disgust and stared at the fading light, feeling almost numb at her unimaginable bad luck, as well as sorrow that she would never be reunited with her mother's sister. When a stiff wind began to blow, she looked back over her shoulder toward the church, feeling as if it were calling to her. She walked over and tried the door. Finding it open, she went in and sat on one of the wooden benches and dropped her head wearily, exhaustion overtaking her. How could this have happened? "Oh God, please take up my case." After some time, a voice came from behind. "Hello there, miss. Can I help you?" Catherine stood up and quickly turned around. "I'm sorry. I hope I am not interfering. The door was unlocked and I just felt the need to pray," she explained to the young man. He looked to be about Christopher's age or a bit older, perhaps in his mid-20s. He had pale blue eyes and a brownish red hair, and she thought a very pleasant disposition. "'Tis perfectly fine, miss. After all, it is what the church is here for. However, you do seem a bit... Are you in distress?" Catherine suddenly felt as if she could talk to this man, and within a few moments the events of the past weeks came tumbling out, and she finished with how she'd arrived to discover that the home she thought was waiting for her did not exist. "Do I sound like a ranting madwoman?" She smiled wanly. "Not at all," the young man answered at once. Many people's lives take a difficult turn at some point, and Catherine was impressed at his composure after hearing her somewhat fantastic tale. She immediately warmed to him. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Rupert Dabing. I am the vicar's nephew. We were visiting here when he became ill with a slight fever the past few days, and I was coming to check on the sanctuary for him. Now I am glad I have. Perhaps there is something I could do for you." He was awestruck with her beauty, but did everything he could not to allow it to become an awkward moment, as was often the case when two young people of the opposite sex found themselves alone, making their introductions. "My name is Catherine Bradshaw," she replied, realizing she had not yet told him this. I appreciate your offer to help, but I fear there is nothing anyone can do for me at this time. Well, certainly if you have nowhere else to go, I cannot lock up and leave you to fend for yourself. Would you be willing to come back to where I am staying with my uncle? My mother and father are there as well. Catherine thought very quickly, as it was fast growing dark, and she knew that respectable offers were few and far between when one was alone and at the mercy of strangers. Rupert, thinking quickly, said, "At least come and meet Gerard and Rebecca, my parents, and have some supper with us. And mayhap you can think of a plan." She knew she must accept his offer and followed the young man out of the church. "I doubt there was ever such a quick answer to a prayer," she said. After Catherine had spilled out the story to Rebecca, the woman asked her how she felt about her brother-in-law now. Catherine supposed Rebecca was attempting to determine if returning to Briarwood was an option, but Catherine was far from that. She knew she could at least eventually find a post of some kind if she could prevail on Rebecca and Gerard to help her for just a little while. She would normally not throw herself on anyone's charity, but the pragmatic side of her realized that she had virtually no choice in this case. "I suppose I never put that question to myself, Rebecca," Catherine answered. "I guess the truth is that I stopped feeling anything at all a long time ago where Julian is concerned. His accusations made me want to forget he even existed. Although he did apologize to me, I'm afraid I was not very forgiving. Even his father pleaded with me not to hold it against him, believing he had spoken out of grief and rage, which I can now admit was probably the case." "However did you respond to that?" Rebecca asked with interest. "Oh, I promised my father-in-law to be sure." It's amazing how easily one can make a promise at a deathbed and go back on it after the person is gone, which is what I did, really. I think I had more unforgiveness in my heart against Julian after his father died than I did before, although I told Lord Bradshaw that I would show mercy. I still remember when Julian asked me to forgive him, and I flatly refused. I know he was sincere. I, who have been merciful to people and claim one should always forgive others, had no compassion for my own husband's brother. God cannot be very happy with me right now. Yes, but remember, he faced all of our same temptations, so he does understand our erratic, unpredictable emotions. You do not seem like an unmerciful woman to me. Grief is an odd thing, and it makes people act in ways they otherwise would not. I think perhaps this is the case with your brother-in-law." "I'm sure you are right," Catherine replied. Then she sighed and said, "But now I have so many other problems. The only address my sister and brother have is my aunt's address in Ease, but now I will not be on the receiving end of any messages, should they be lucky enough to post any. I must write to the household at Briarwood and ask them to try to get a message to them, which will not be easy." She explained about her father's Puritan fanaticism. "I asked a trusted servant to send me any news of them, but she only has my aunt's address as well. I must return eventually to get them, but of course I need to be established somewhere before I can do so. I thought I had taken a big step towards solving my problem when I came to France, but it seems I've only complicated matters further." "Well, you couldn't know she was going to die," Gerard said kindly. "I suppose that's why she wanted me to come. One doesn't tell such news through a messenger unless there is no choice. She obviously thought she would live much longer than she did. Well, we are shortly travelling back to Bordeaux, to a village just outside the famous Chateau Pape Clement. There seems always to be positions available for educated ladies, which would at least give you some wages. Your lodging will be no problem, as you could stay with us until you decide what to do." "Oh, Rebecca," Catherine said, "that plan sounds wonderful to me, but are you sure you have no objection to a perfect stranger staying with you?" "I'm sure," Rebecca smiled. "It would not be the first time Gerard and I have helped those who have fallen on hard times. It is the way to live."